Welcome to The Voter's Voice, where we lay out the bills and you decide if they make sense.
The numbers are, frankly, well, they're startling. More than 2 in 5 households here spending over 30% of their income just on housing.
Just to keep a roof over their heads.
Exactly. And get this, a staggering 1 in 5, they're shelling out more than 50%.
Wow. 50.
Yeah. And this isn't just about the money, right? It's the financial, the physical, even the emotional toll this takes on families. It's profound.
Absolutely. And the ripple effects on the economy, they're huge too.
Oh, totally grim. It's estimated to depress California's whole GDP by about 2%.
2%. That's significant.
It really is. And it leads to hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 600,000 a year, reportedly just leaving the state, looking for somewhere they can actually afford.
Can't blame them, really.
It's this pervasive, undeniable crisis. And, well, into this crisis steps Assembly Bill 11. It's called the Social Housing Act. The state itself says it has a duty to act on this.
Right.
It's California's, well, bold, maybe transformative attempt to rewrite the housing rules. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
So at its core, AB11 is about establishing this new body, the California Housing Authority, or the CHA.
CHA, got it.
And its main job, its foundational mission, is pretty clear. Bridge that huge gap, I mean, it's massive, between how much housing we need based on regional assessments, the RH&A targets, and how much actually gets built.
Yeah.
Right now, something like 97% of localities, they fail to meet these targets.
97%.
Yeah. And the CHA also aims to preserve existing affordable housing, stop the bleeding there too. But the big vision, the long-term goal in the bill, it's incredibly ambitious.
Okay, what is it?
They want to ensure that no Californian pays more than 30% of their income on housing.
By the year 2050.
2050. Wow. Okay. 30% max. That's a statement. It is. And central to making this happen is this concept of social housing.
Right. What exactly is social housing under this bill?
So the definition they use is publicly owned mixed income housing. The key thing is it's intentionally removed from the usual market forces, speculation and all that.
Okay, removed from the market.
Yeah. The goal is for it to stay affordable forever, basically. Perpetually affordable under public control. And housing a mix of incomes from like extremely low all the way up to above moderate.
Interesting. So our mission for you today, listening in, is to take a real deep dive into this whole framework of AB11. We're going to look at the potential benefits, which sound significant, but also, just as importantly, the potential drawbacks, the considerable ones.
Got to look at both sides.
Exactly. By the end of this, you should have a much clearer picture of what this ambitious proposal could actually mean for you and, well, for the whole state. So, okay, we've laid out the crisis. The big question is, how does AB11 actually promise to deliver on such a massive challenge? Let's start with that housing production gap. How does the CHA figure out how many units we actually need?
Well, the CHA is specifically tasked with doing an annual determination. They look at the gap between those RH&A targets we mentioned and the actual construction data.
Okay, so it's systematic.
Yeah, it's meant to be a clear methodology, a pathway to closing that deficit that almost everyone's failing on right now. And a really crucial part of this strategy is this net increase provision. So if they say tear down some existing affordable units to build something new, the new project has to include more affordable units broken down by income group than were originally there.
So you're always gaining, not just replacing.
Exactly. Ensures a net increase. Plus, the CHA will prioritize buying properties that are at risk of losing their affordability status. Like rent-controlled places or buildings where the affordability agreements are about to expire.
That seems smart. Plug in the leaks.
Right. It's a proactive strategy. Right. Because otherwise you're just like trying to fill a leaky bucket, right? You build new stuff, but you keep losing the old stuff.
Makes sense. That systematic approach sounds, well, promising on paper, but how does it actually translate into housing that people can genuinely afford, especially with that huge goal? Nobody paying more than 30% by 2050. How do they make the math work?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe $1 billion. That's where this really innovative financial idea comes in. It's called revenue neutrality.
Revenue neutrality, okay.
Achieved through something called rent cross-subsidization, or sometimes cost rent. The basic idea is this. Lower-income residents in a building pay rent that's below the actual cost of operating their unit.
Okay, below cost.
And that difference is made up by having higher income residents in the same building pay rent that's above the operating cost.
So the higher earners subsidize the lower earners within the same development.
Precisely. It balances out. The goal is to make the whole project financially viable overall, while pushing maximum affordability to those who need it most. It's not totally new. It's inspired by models that have worked elsewhere, like Vienna and Singapore.
Well, Vienna, right. I've heard about their model.
Yeah, it's quite successful. And there's another really critical policy innovation here, too.
What's that?
The bill states that rent adjustments, if someone's income goes up, have to be applied in a manner that does not discourage the resident's pursuit of higher income.
Okay, that sounds important. What does it mean practically, avoiding the poverty trap?
Exactly. It's a direct shot at that classic welfare cliff problem, where earning a bit more money means you suddenly lose a huge chunk of benefits, making you worse off.
Right, which disincentivizes people from trying to earn more.
Totally. AB11 tries to fundamentally shift that dynamic, let people move up the ladder without fearing they'll lose their basic housing stability. That's a huge hurdle many other social programs globally even still really struggle with.
Okay, that is a big deal if they can pull it off. Now, you mentioned innovation. One of the really interesting parts of this bill seems to be resident empowerment. How does AB11 actually strengthen protections for tenants and, maybe more importantly, get them involved in managing these places?
Yeah, the protections are pretty robust on paper. Residents get due process rights before any eviction. And they're protected against termination without just cause.
Like the existing statewide just cause eviction rules.
Exactly. Similar concept. Landlords need a valid, legally defined reason. They can't just kick people out arbitrarily. But beyond that, residents have an explicit right to participate directly and meaningfully in decision-making.
Directly and meaningfully. How does that actually work?
Well, each multifamily social housing building or complex will have a resident governance council made up of up to 10% of the residents.
Yeah.
These councils will hold regular meetings, give feedback to the property management, represent their building's interests at meetings with the main CHA board twice a year, and they even get to decide how to spend money for common room amenities and have a say in approving renovation projects.
So real input on their living environment.
That's the idea. And the accountability goes right to the top.
How so?
3 resident representatives will actually sit on the main California Housing Authority board, the big one.
Wow, on the actual board.
Yep. Initially, they'll be appointed, but the plan is for them to eventually be elected by a vote of all social housing residents across the state.
So direct accountability from residents to the highest level. That's pretty significant.
It really is. A powerful mechanism for resident voice, if it works as intended.
Okay, so voice is covered. What about where these places actually get built? Is there a strategy? How does the bill prioritize locations?
Yeah, there's a definite strategy. The bill prioritizes using vacant, underutilized, or surplus public lands.
Government-owned land.
Right. And also sites near transit hubs, transit-oriented development.
Which makes sense for costs, right? Land is expensive.
Hugely expensive, especially in California. So using public land could significantly cut those initial development costs. And that makes hitting that revenue neutrality goal we talked about much more achievable.
Good point. Cheaper land, easier to balance the books.
Exactly. The bill also says they need input from local governments on things like the number of stories, number of units, the specifics of the site.
Okay. And are these all just standard rentals? Or are there other options?
Good question. There's the standard rental model, yeah, probably with 1-year leases. But the bill also introduces other options. One is called a limited equity ownership model.
Limited equity ownership. How does that work?
It's basically a long-term lease, 99 years. But it comes with a specific resale formula. The formula is designed to strike a balance between keeping the unit affordable for the next resident while also allowing the current resident to build some equity, generate a bit of wealth.
So you get some return, but it's capped to keep it affordable.
Exactly. It allows for what the bill calls a reasonable return on investment, but it prevents the kind of huge speculative gains that would price the unit out of reach later on.
Interesting. Sort of a middle ground.
Yeah. And the CHA can even act as a lender to help people get into this ownership model.
Okay. And just briefly, let's touch on funding. How is all this paid for? We mentioned revenue neutrality for operations, but what about building the stuff?
Right, the upfront capital. The bill mentions a social housing revolving loan fund that would offer zero-interest loans, presumably for developers building these projects.
Okay.
But critically, it also relies heavily on bonds. 2 types.
Bonds, okay.
General obligation bonds or JAGO bonds. These are backed by the state's general fund, meaning essentially state tax revenue. Taxpayers are directly on the hook to repay these.
Okay, so that's a direct cost to taxpayers ultimately.
Right.
Yes.
And then there are revenue bonds. These are supposed to be repaid only from the revenue generated by the housing projects themselves, the rents collected.
So less direct risk to the general taxpayer with those.
In theory, yes. But understanding that distinction, especially the reliance on GOGO bonds, is really crucial when we talk about the potential financial risk to the state and its taxpayers.
Definitely. Okay, so that covers the promises, the mechanisms. Now, we have to pivot. Let's talk about the other side of the coin, the potential pitfalls. What are the concerns? First off, market impacts. What happens when you create this big chunk of housing that's explicitly, as you said, removed from market forces? What could that do to the rest of the housing market in California?
Yeah, that's a major area of concern for economists and, frankly, for the private development industry. By operating outside the normal supply and demand dynamics, this new social housing sector could, well, significantly distort the existing private market.
How so? Distort it how?
Well, it could potentially reduce overall demand for private market housing, both rental and for sale. If there's a desirable, affordable public option, fewer people might compete for market rate units.
Which could affect prices.
Exactly. It could potentially put downward pressure on private property values and rental rates in some areas. And that cost rent model we talked about, where social housing aims for limited or no proceeds beyond operating costs. That could effectively set an artificial ceiling on rents in the social housing sector, making nearby private market rents look comparatively very high. This might lead to what some worry could become a two-tiered housing market.
Two tiers, one market-driven, one publicly controlled.
Right, with potentially very different economic characteristics and maybe even social perceptions. And there's another risk, crowding out
Private developers?
Potentially.
Sure.
If the presence of large-scale social housing shrinks the profit margins for private developers, especially for affordable or middle-income projects, they might pull back. They might invest less or focus only on the very high end, which, ironically, could slow down overall housing production, the very problem the bill aims to solve.
That's a tricky potential consequence. Okay, what about the money? Despite that revenue neutrality goal for operations, what are the real financial burdens that might fall on California taxpayers? You mentioned the JAGO bonds.
Right, and this is where there's a sort of fundamental tension in the bill's design. Revenue neutrality sounds great, sounds self-sufficient for day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, implies it pays for itself.
But the bill itself explicitly states it will rely on those general obligation bonds, again, repaid by taxpayers for the initial capital to build everything.
Okay.
And it also relies on legislative appropriations. That's just money allocated directly from the state budget, also taxpayer funded for things like the revolving loan fund and potentially covering ongoing shortfalls if revenue doesn't match expenses.
So taxpayer money is definitely involved up front and maybe ongoing.
Absolutely. And remember that definition of revenue neutrality. It vaguely includes other subsidies.
You mentioned that wasn't defined.
Exactly. It's not clear what those other subsidies are. Are they internal cross-subsidies, or are they external funds, potentially more taxpayer money, needed to make the numbers work? That ambiguity is a concern.
So the direct financial burdens are clear. Repaying JOGO bonds from the general fund, legislative appropriations from tax dollars for the loan fund and maybe operations, plus the administrative costs of running the whole CHA bureaucracy, salaries, offices, oversight.
Precisely. Those are direct costs coming out of the state budget, which ultimately means your tax dollars.
And what about indirect costs? You mentioned that other subsidies, vagueness.
Right. If those other subsidies aren't generated internally within the projects, or if the rent cross-subsidization isn't quite enough to cover all the costs, especially for deeper affordability levels, well, that burden has to shift somewhere. Likely it falls back onto the broader tax base through ongoing state support.
So that revenue neutrality claim needs a big asterisk next to it.
I think that's fair. It seems to primarily apply to operational self-sufficiency, aiming to minimize the need for ongoing direct operating subsidies. But it absolutely places a significant initial capital burden and potentially ongoing capital or GAB funding burden squarely on the state's general fund and therefore on California taxpayers.
And what about the buildings themselves? You mentioned the limited or no proceeds idea. Does that create risks for long-term maintenance?
That's another significant concern. If projects are designed to just break even operationally, with limited or no extra revenue generated, where does the money come from for major repairs, renovations, or non-essential upgrades down the line?
Right. Things wear out, roofs need replacing, systems need updating.
Exactly. There's a real risk of deferred maintenance. If the money simply isn't there in the operating budget or reserves because the focus is purely on minimal cost rent, properties could deteriorate over time.
That's a crucial point. We've all seen, unfortunately, how public housing or infrastructure can decline without consistent, dedicated funding for upkeep. It really begs the question, how does the bill specifically plan to avoid that? To avoid becoming another cautionary tale of underfunded long-term maintenance, especially if those revenue streams aren't as robust as they hope.
Well, that's actually one of the gaps or potential weaknesses critics point to. The bill itself doesn't explicitly mandate a super robust, transparent, long-term capital maintenance plan. It doesn't spell out exactly how sufficient reserves must be built up and protected.
So it's not baked into the legislation itself.
Not in explicit detail. This is definitely an area where future regulations developed by the CHA or perhaps legislative amendments would be absolutely critical. You need clear rules to prevent the slow deterioration of these really valuable public assets. Otherwise, you build it, and then 20, 30 years later,
it falls apart.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the bureaucracy itself. Setting up a whole new massive state agency, the CHA. What are the risks there? Governance, operational complexities. Could it actually slow things down?
Oh, absolutely. Establishing any large independent state body like this comes with inherent risks. You've got potential for slow decision-making, bureaucracy bogging things down. Cost overruns are almost a given in large-scale government projects sometimes.
Red tape.
Red tape, exactly. And then there's the structure of the CHA board itself. It's this blend, right? Appointed experts alongside elected resident representatives.
Which sounds good for democracy, but
could lead to friction. You might have clashes between the technical, maybe long-term financial perspective of the appointed experts and the more immediate on-the-ground priorities of the resident reps. And what's particularly concerning to some analysts is that very short one-year term for the elected resident representatives.
Only 1 year. That's really short. It is. It raises concerns about continuity. Can someone really get up to speed, build influence, and understand the complexities of running a statewide housing authority in just 12 months?
Probably not easily.
Right. It could lead to a constant churn, a lack of institutional knowledge among the resident reps, potentially making their representation more symbolic than truly substantive in shaping long-term policy.
Yeah, that's a fair point about the term length. Okay, so with all these moving parts, the funding questions, the board structure, what about legal issues? Are there parts of the bill that are just too vague? Things that could lead to lawsuits or big implementation headaches down the road?
Yes, there are definitely several key terms and concepts left undefined or ambiguous in the legislative text itself.
Yeah.
And that vagueness could absolutely lead to disputes, delays, and legal challenges.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, well, we already mentioned other subsidies in the revenue neutrality definition. That's a big one. What does it mean? The specific formula for that limited equity resale model. Not spelled out. It just says it should balance affordability and wealth generation and offer a reasonable return on investment.
But reasonable is subjective.
Totally subjective. What's reasonable to a resident might not seem reasonable to the CHA trying to preserve affordability. That's a recipe for conflict.
Okay, what else?
Even the conditions for when a local government can object to a proposed site and demand an alternative. The bill mentions things like finding suitable alternative sites or ensuring comparable community amenities. Again, highly subjective terms. What's suitable? What's comparable?
Yeah, easy to argue over that.
Definitely. And one more, related to tenant screening. While the bill aims for inclusivity and limits using criminal records for denial, it makes an exception for applicants who pose a clear and manifest danger.
But it doesn't define clear and manifest danger.
Left undefined. Which raises concerns about potential inconsistencies in application, maybe discrimination claims, and even legitimate safety concerns if the standard isn't clear.
So for our listeners, when you talk about that resale formula for limited equity, what are the typical ways that's structured in other places? Is it usually tied to inflation or a fixed percentage increase or something else? What's the worry about leaving it wide open like this?
That's a great question. Yeah, typically in other limited equity models, you see formulas tied to things like the area median income changes, or maybe the consumer price index, inflation, or sometimes just a fixed modest percentage increase per year of ownership.
Okay, so there are established ways to do it.
Right. The goal is usually to provide some return, acknowledging the owner's investment and upkeep, but ensuring the price remains affordable for the next low or moderate income buyer. Leaving it completely open, as AB11 currently does, well, it essentially kicks the can down the road.
Giving the CHA board enormous power.
Exactly. Yeah. The CHA board gets to decide this crucial piece of the puzzle later. That risks inconsistency from project to project. It risks political pressure influencing the formula, and it definitely risks legal challenges from residents who feel the formula is unfair, or from affordability advocates if they feel it allows too much equity buildup.
So all this vagueness, it's not just semantics. It means a lot of the actual policy gets made later by the CHA board, not the legislature.
Precisely. It delegates substantial policymaking power away from the elected legislature to this appointed elected board, which can be efficient sometimes, but also risks inconsistent application, lack of transparency, and, as we said, legal battles.
Okay. What about broader social impacts? Could there be unintended consequences? Like, could this actually lead to more segregation, ironically, or just massive waiting lists?
So, both are potential concerns. There's a worry that by creating a very distinct social housing sector, explicitly separate from the private market, it could inadvertently reinforce social divisions. It might become perceived, rightly or wrongly, as housing only for certain groups, potentially leading to geographic or social segregation rather than true integration.
A separate, maybe stigmatized sector.
That's the risk some foresee. Also, there's the funding issue again. If large amounts of state money are channeled into this new model, does that divert funds and attention from existing successful affordable housing programs or Section 8 vouchers? You need to make sure you're adding capacity, not just shifting resources around.
Good point. And the waitlist issue.
Well, given the sheer scale of California's housing shortage, we're talking millions of units needed. Even an ambitious social housing program will take many, many years to make a significant dent.
Right. It's not an overnight fix.
Not at all. So the bill relies on a lottery system for choosing residents, even with preferences for people who've been displaced. But the demand will vastly outstrip the supply for the foreseeable future. That could create incredibly long waiting lists, the waitlist effect, leading to frustration and maybe a perception that the program isn't really accessible for most people who need it.
Yeah, managing expectations there will be key. So, okay, looking ahead, we've identified a lot of challenges alongside the potential benefits. What needs to happen to make sure this bill, if it moves forward and gets implemented, actually delivers? What are the key recommendations for fixing some of these potential problems? Our sources mentioned clarifying those ambiguities.
Definitely. Legislative clarification is top of the list. Defining terms like other subsidies, reasonable return, clear and manifest danger. Developing clear, transparent formulas and guidelines for things like the limited equity resale before projects get off the ground. Proactive community engagement is also vital.
What else specifically?
Well, addressing that long-term maintenance issue is critical. To ensure success, they really need to mandate, either through legislation or very strong CHA regulations, a robust, transparent, long-term capital maintenance plan for every single property.
Spell out how reserves will be built and protected.
Exactly. Show us the money for future repairs. Also, revisiting those one-year terms for resident reps on the CHA board, extending them to, say, 2 or 3 years, could make a huge difference.
Give them time to learn the ropes and actually have an impact.
Right. Foster continuity, allow them to develop deeper expertise, make their voice truly effective, not just symbolic. Taking steps like these, clarifying the language, planning for maintenance, empowering residents meaningfully, these are paramount for making this work effectively and transparently.
Makes sense.
Look, AB11 is, without a doubt, a bold response, and arguably a necessary one given the scale of the crisis. It offers this really powerful vision for a more equitable, more affordable housing future in California. That commitment to a non-market, perpetually affordable sector, plus the strong focus on resident participation, that's significant.
It is a powerful vision. But as we've discussed, its success really hinges on navigating all those inherent complexities we talked about. It requires meticulous implementation, clear rules, and incredibly transparent financial management. It's this ambitious blueprint for change, but the devil, as they always say,
is in the details.
Exactly. It's all in the details of execution.
Absolutely.
So the final thought we want to leave you with today is this. What is the optimal balance between creating this new non-market social housing sector and nurturing the existing private market? How will California navigate this fundamental shift? How does it build the housing it desperately needs without creating unintended consequences for you, for residents, and for the state's broader economy?
Hope you enjoyed this episode. Tune in again to make sense out of all the bills.